welcome to session number 2, In the Promised Land. In the first session, we covered the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Law or the Pentateuch. Remember, there was a memory assignment to learn the books of the Bible, and so let's go over that from Genesis through Song of Solomon. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Good. Now let's turn to Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, and that would be page 16 in your workbooks. Here's the timeline once again. And we see Joshua at this point. We've talked about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his 12 sons going to Egypt, Moses leading the people out of Egypt, and after Moses' death, Joshua takes over. The theme of Joshua is choice. Joshua is a Hebrew word, and it means Yahweh is salvation. Jesus, a Greek word, means the same thing. Yahweh is salvation. Just as Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, so Jesus leads us into heaven. Joshua emphasizes 5 things. First of all, the importance of the law. Chapter 1, verse 8. This book of instruction must not depart from your mouth. You're to recite it day and night, so that you may be careful to observe everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and have success. And so the book of the law is important, and it's emphasized in this section. Let's turn to Rahab as the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and marched toward Jericho. What did she do? Well, she hid 2 of the spies that came to spy on Jericho. And why did she do that? She is a pagan woman living in a pagan city. Why would she be a traitor against her own people and help these Israelite spies? Well, we read about that in chapter 2, verse 4. Joshua 2, verse 4. I know that the Lord has given you this land. In verse 11, we've heard what you've done and lost heart, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. This woman that was a pagan that might have previously worshipped a sun god or a moon god, gods of that locale, now is professing her faith in a God that is God over all creation, who is sovereign, who is Lord over everything in heaven and earth. That's quite a big step for her, but that is the faith that we are seeing in her life. Her one request, again in Joshua chapter 2, was to spare the lives of her own family. And the spies, the Israelite spies, replied, we will if you won't report our mission. And so she lowered them out of the window with a red cord. And we read in chapter 2, verse 17, the men said to her, we will be free from this oath you made us swear, unless when we enter the land, you tie this scarlet cord to the window through which you let us down. Bring your father, mother, brothers, and all your father's family into your house. If anyone goes out of the doors of your house, his blood will be on his own head, and we will be innocent. Notice here, again, the red thread weaving its way through the Old Testament. It was a scarlet cord or a red rope that they used to lower the spies down. And it was that red rope hung out the window that saved Rahab and her family. Rahab, as a result of her faithfulness, became, from the life of a pagan prostitute, ended up in the genealogy of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we see her listed there as the great-great-grandmother of King David. Going to the second part of Joshua, God's holiness in judging sin. The Israelites were to give everything that they collected from this battle of Jericho back to God, put it in God's treasury. Jericho was to be a tithe to God. But what happened? One of the soldiers by the name of Achan took some of what was meant to be set apart for God, and he kept it for himself. And the result, they lost their next battle, the Battle of Ai. And when Achan was found out, he and his family were stoned as a result. We see a similar story at the beginning of the New Testament with Ananias and Sapphira. They also lied to God about the amount of money they received from the land that they had sold. And as a result, they were killed as well. God is holy, and we are to be holy also. We see that in the story of Achan as well as in the story of Ananias and Sapphira. The third part of Joshua, God's faithfulness in conflict. They returned to Ai and defeated it in battle this time. Joshua then built an altar that Moses had commanded back in Deuteronomy chapter 27 that they build once they entered the promised land. I'll read from Joshua chapter 8, verse 30. At that time, Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal to the Lord, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded. It's interesting. A lot of people will criticize Christians. They will say that the Bible isn't true. But yet we see a lot of evidence of the truthfulness of the Bible, and in particular with archaeology. Here we have a picture of a story that was in Reader's Digest, Joshua and the Archaeologist. There was an archaeologist about 170 years ago that was digging on Mount Ebal, and a place that hadn't been excavated before. And as he is digging there, he sees what he believes to be eventually this altar that Joshua built. Now, we don't know for sure, but yet it was found on Mount Ebal. Everything points to the fact that this is the altar that Joshua built. After they dug it out and reconstructed it, this is what it looks like. And so not only this, but many other instances where archaeologists have unearthed things, they have proven the Bible to be true. And so we don't have to fear that there's going to be something discovered that shows the Bible to be false. Everything that's discovered has proven the Bible to be true. Well, after building this altar, Joshua continued on with the campaign to the south part of Israel, and then turned to the north, the northern campaign, and that completes chapters 11 and 12 in Joshua. Going to chapter 13 is when the tribes receive their inheritances. The land is divided up amongst the 12 tribes. In chapter 13, verse 1, we're told of this time. It says, "You have become old and advanced in years, Joshua, and a great deal of the land remains to be possessed." Even though they had gone through a campaign from the north to the south, still they hadn't eradicated all the holdouts, those some of the Canaanites that were still there. And so, after taking over the land, they all lived happily ever after, right? No, they still needed to get rid of those strongholds where when each tribe took possession of their land, they were to go and eliminate the few people that were left. Joshua warned them that if you cling to these nations, if you intermarry, if you let them remain with you, if you associate with them, they will be a snare and a trap to you. And so, did they drive them out completely? No. They didn't. They failed to do so. And we read about this in the first chapter of Judges. And why was that? Why didn't they eliminate them? Because they wanted them to serve as forced labor. It was convenient for them to keep these people as slaves. They chose to let them remain in the land. And as a result, they did become a snare and a trap to them. And so that brings us to the last point of Joshua. the importance of choice. Joshua assembled all the tribes together. We read about this in Joshua 22 through chapter 24. And this is what the Lord said to them. I took Abraham from his homeland. I gave him Isaac. I gave Isaac Jacob and Esau. I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you to the Jordan River, handing your enemies over to you. I gave you a land that you did not work for. In other words, God had been faithful to the Israelites. And what is their response? Will they choose to serve him? This is Joshua's challenge in chapter 24, verse 15. Choose who you will worship. As for me and my house, we choose to serve and worship the Lord. We've been given free will. Our lives revolve around the choices we make. They're almost totally determined by those choices. Choices made in the physical realm, what we eat or drink, whether we exercise. In the realm of the mind and the soul, what we think about, how we spend our time, our money, the attitude that we have. And also, choices made in the spiritual realm, if and how we will love and serve God. Have my choices been wise ones? Next, we'll see the choices that they made. Here's another timeline, and it goes to the next time we'll be talking about. After the period of Joshua and the few years that it took them to take over the land and divide up their inheritance, now we come to the period of the Judges, a period of about 350 years. And it goes from Joshua until the United Kingdom with King Saul. Judges, the theme of this book, is recurring sin. Joshua was a book of victory. Judges is a book of defeat. Here's a list of the 14 judges that ruled through this time period. And as you can see, they started with Othniel, who was a good judge, but got progressively worse until they came to Eli. And then the last judge, Samuel, who was a good judge. There's a map here also that shows, if you can see it, the white boxes that are spread all throughout the land of Israel, indicating that enemies would rise up against the Israelites. And at that time, God would raise up a judge to judge those enemies and to defeat them. And you can see they are spread throughout the entire area of Israel over that 350-year period. And so that is the period that we're talking about now. One of the best known of the judges was Samson. Remember that he died as he killed 3,000 Philistines, according to the Bible. Sometimes there's information that we get outside of the Bible, extra biblical sources, and one of those seemed to indicate that maybe Samson lived a long life. Again, this is from a Far Side cartoon. Here we have the Samson family at home. There's Samson and Delilah. It looks like they've put on a few pounds over the years. And their two sons have just broken a vase. Uh-oh, we're in for it now, Sid. Dad's going for the jawbone. Well, on a more serious note, Judges is all about the cycle of apostasy, where apostasy is defined as a departure from the truth that God has revealed to us in His Word. And we can see how this apostasy works its way out through this cycle that happens throughout Judges. It starts with a sin that the people commit. They fall into sin. That leads to servitude. An enemy comes and takes them over and rules them for a number of years in many cases. The people cry out, supplication. They cry to God to be saved from the enemy. And so God sends salvation in the form of a judge. He raises up a judge like Samson or Gideon. And after they have defeated their enemy, there's a period of serenity, a period of peace. Judges can be summed up with the last verse of the book. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I'd like to talk about this for just a few minutes because it's the same attitude that we have in the United States today, where people are doing what they want to do, what they think is right in their own eyes. From 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, we are told that the day of the Lord, when Jesus returns to set up his kingdom on earth, that won't come unless the apostasy comes first, this falling away from the truth. And so truth is important. In the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 37, Jesus tells us the reason he came into the world. I have come into the world to testify to the truth. And Pilate asks the question, what is truth? And so I would like to talk about truth by just giving you 5 words to describe it. First of all, truth is reality. It is real. It is what actually happened. A person testifying in court tells what they witnessed, what they observed. And that is what truth is. It is reality. Jesus gives us reality, the reality of heaven, the reality of hell. Truth is also objective. It's not just a preference or a personal opinion, but it's things that actually happened that are going to be seen objectively. Truth is also narrow. Truth is narrow in the physical world. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's never 5. It's never 3.999. 2 plus 2 is 4. And not only is truth narrow in the physical world, but it's narrow in the spiritual world as well. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that the way is broad that leads to destruction, but the way is narrow that leads to life. Also, truth is revealed from God. In John 8, 31 and 32, if you abide in my word, you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And also, the truth is absolute. It is unchanging. But our culture has fallen away from the truth. I believe we're living now in this time of the apostasy where we have fallen away from the truth. And that, going back to 2 Thessalonians, we are told that the day of the Lord will come after this falling away from the truth. I believe the day of the Lord could happen at any time now. And so, let me explain this idea of truth and that we have fallen away, show how we have fallen away with it, with just a very abbreviated history lesson. After the fall of the Roman Empire, about 450 years after the beginning of the church at Pentecost, the Western Europe and that part of the world entered into the so-called Dark Ages. The only Bibles that were around were those that were hand-copied manuscripts. Then in the 1450s, Johann Gutenberg created the printing press. And why did he do that? This is a quote that he gives. Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of books. Let us give wings to the truth in order that she may go and win every soul that comes into this world. In other words, God's word, God's truth is now revealed. People before hadn't had an opportunity to individually own a Bible, but now more and more people were having copies of the Bible, and they were reading it for themselves, and God's truth is now being revealed to the masses. This printing of the Bibles followed with an explosion from out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. It also resulted in the explosion of modern science. It had revealed the Bible, an orderly universe. People now, as they read this, realized that there was a God who was sovereign. The God of the Greeks and the Romans were gods of chaos and unorder. But here, now, they could see that God was a God of order. And they saw natural laws that they observed. And they started building laws based on what they observed. And this led from Revelation to reason. Reason is good. In Isaiah 1, verse 18, we are told that God tells us, "Come, let us reason together." And so mankind, through reason, still believed in an absolute truth. Remember John 8, 31 and 32. If you abide in my word, think of a bubble that is God's word. If you abide within my word, you will know the truth and it will set you free. This truth is absolute. Well, with reason, they still believed in absolute truth. They believed in this bubble that if people would reason together, they could all live peacefully on the earth. But over the next 300 years, a very gradual shift came about. And we entered into a time period known as the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Modern Man. At this time, they came to believe that they could only trust what they could observe with their natural senses. Now, realize that up until this time, they still believed in revelation, they believed in reason. But as they, over this 300-year period, people started to doubt revelation. They started to doubt the Bible. They said, we are a people of reason. We believe in the laws of gravity and planetary motion. And to say that somebody walked once on water or changed that water into wine, or that they were raised from the dead, that isn't reasonable. Those are fairy tales. And so they came to reject revelation. They only believed in reason. That's what they trusted in. And so they gradually shifted away from revelation altogether. But then, over a gradual period of time, again, a couple of hundred years, reason also failed. In the 20th century, reason led to the bloodiest century on record, with all the wars that happened in the 20th century. There were totalitarian regimes in this century by Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot in Cambodia. There was the Industrial Revolution. And even though there was certainly good aspects to the industrialized society that we became, still this drew people away from the rural areas into cities where there was more congestion and tensions grew. Technology is good. We all love technology. But yet this has not only given us things that are good, but it has given us the tools with which we can destroy ourselves. And so, after World War II, people came to reject reason. They saw World War II and lost hope, and lost hope in reason. They thought there's no way that there is an absolute truth that we can live within and live peacefully. And so they rejected that for something called relativism. Relativism means there is no absolute right or wrong. That truth is relative. That truth changes. There is no single bubble of truth, but people live within their own individual bubbles, believing what they want to believe. Now we can choose to live as we want. We can find our own truth, doing whatever we want, whether it be abortion, smoking pot, non-biblical sexual practices, or whatever. We each live within our own little bubble of truth. I have here a copy of the Parade Sunday magazine, and you can see there's Tobey Maguire, an actor. And in this article, he made the statement, I had to find my own truth. This just shows that that's what people are doing now in our country. They are living, trying to live by their own version of truth. But when you have on a planet with over 7 billion people, each person living differently based on what they think truth is, a truth that's relative, it's going to cause conflicts as people start bumping against each other. And so what is the answer to that? Well, it's that we have to be tolerant of others. We can live however we want to, and we just have to be tolerant about how other people live. The problem with this is that Christians pop that truth bubble of others when we say Jesus is the only way. That makes us the intolerant ones, the narrow-minded ones. But remember, truth is narrow. We're living in the time of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25. Everyone doing whatever is right in their own eyes. We've departed from the truth. We're living in this time of the apostasy. Let's go on to the next book of Ruth. The main theme of Ruth is redemption. The Hebrew word for redeemer or redemption is used 20 times in this short book. We can see Ruth here appears during the time of the judges. You can see that in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. There's a man by the name of Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They had 2 sons, and they left Judah for Moab. But then Elimelech died. His 2 sons married, but after 10 years, they also died. And so Naomi is getting ready to return to Judah, urging her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law to remain in their homeland. Orpah stays in Moab, but Ruth replies, chapter 1, verse 16, wherever you go, I go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And so Ruth and Naomi return to Israel. Here is a picture of Ruth as she gleans from the fields, and a picture of Boaz, who notices Ruth and asks about her. And so Naomi instructs her in the Israelite redemption process that Boaz, a relative of Naomi, can redeem or buy back Naomi's land, but there are certain rules that have to be followed. There's a closer relative who has the right of redemption. And so after a negotiation process, we read in the book of Ruth that Boaz redeems the land. He marries Ruth, and as Rahab's son, they become the great-grandparents of King David. And again, you can see Ruth listed along with Rahab in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, verse 5. What we see in the book of Ruth is faithfulness in the midst of unfaithfulness. In Judges, we saw unfaithfulness, but Ruth is an example of love and faithfulness. At the end of the period of the Judges, that brings us to the United Kingdom. Here we have the Judges, and then here the kings start. With the United Kingdom, the last judge, remember, was Samuel, and he was a very good judge. Again, he was the link between judges and the monarchy, the United Kingdom. His sons were evil, and so when Samuel was old, the elders of Israel came to him and said, appoint a king to judge us like the other nations have. God had been faithful for the previous 350 years to raise up a judge when it was needed. But now, God and Samuel both realize that this is a bad thing, but that's what the people want. Instead of trusting God to raise up a judge, they want a king that they can look to, that they can see. And so Saul is anointed by Samuel as the first king. But he was disobedient in 1 Samuel. And there's King Saul. He was obedient. Saul was disobedient, and God rejected him as a king. And so at that point, Samuel anoints another person, David, to be king. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have the story of David and Goliath. And after that, in the rest of the remainder of 1 Samuel, chapters 18 through 31, we see that the friendship develop between David and Saul's son, Jonathan. Also, we see the controversy, the struggle between David and King Saul. And then eventually we read about Saul's death. And that brings us to the end of 1 Samuel. Going on to 2 Samuel, the second king is, of course, David. And as far as the time of this is concerned, remember Abraham lived around 2000 BC. We associate David with being king around 1000 BC. In the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, we hear nothing but good news. David unites the kingdom. He's anointed king. He returns the ark to Jerusalem, and he wins many wars. But then we come to chapter 11, and this is the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. And in chapter 12, David is confronted by the prophet Nathan, and he repents and is forgiven. But from that point on, through the end of 2 Samuel, chapters 13 through 24, David's sins, as well as ours, have consequences. Even though we're forgiven, there are consequences to what we have done. David and Bathsheba's son died. David's son, Amnon, raped his half-sister, Tamar, which led Absalom, Tamar's brother, to kill Amnon and rebel against David. David took an ill-advised census that resulted in a plague. There were many bad things that happened in the last chapters of David's life. That leads us to 1 Kings. And who is the third king? Well, it was David's son, Solomon. And we read about that in the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, Solomon's reign. If you'd like a tip how to keep track of this, just remember that in 1 Samuel, we have the first king, Saul. In 2 Samuel, we read about the second king, David. And the third king, Solomon, we read about in the next book, 1 Kings. So if you are wondering where to find the story of David and Goliath, that was before David became king, and so you would read about that in 1 Samuel. Or if you want to read about King David, things that happened, his affair with Bathsheba, you would go to 2 Samuel to read about that. And so, in 1 Kings, Solomon is anointed the king. His father David dies. And then God appears to Solomon in a dream and asks him, "What should I give you?" And Solomon is very wise, and he says, "Please give your servant an obedient heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil." And so God grants Solomon's wish. And this is where we see the story of the two women coming with one child, and how Solomon says to split the child in half to be able to determine who the true mother was. We see the building of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings chapter 6. And his wealth and reputation spread throughout the area, so that the Queen of Sheba visits him in chapter 10. But when we get to chapter 11, some bad things are happening to Solomon. We are told that he has 700 wives, 300 concubines, and that they turned his heart away from God and seduced him to follow their false gods. And so, with Solomon's death, that brings an end to the United Kingdom. But before proceeding to that, I would just like to talk about these three kings for just a moment. Saul, David, and Solomon all did wrong things. So what was so different about David? Why was he said to be the best king, a man after God's own heart? Saul had a son of his that he named after Baal. He combined his beliefs in Yahweh with the beliefs of Baal. He followed after false gods. Solomon did the same thing. He went after false gods, as I just mentioned. But how about David? He never worshiped idols, never worshiped a false god. He sinned, but he never worshiped idols, and he repented of that sin. And so we need to remember that regardless of what we've done, God will forgive us and use us as long as we repent and serve only Him and not idols. We don't have to be perfect, but He does want us to be faithful, to seek Him alone. That brings an end to the United Kingdom, and in the second half of this session, we will discuss the divided kingdom.